I stood outside the funeral of the man I called my husband for 27 years, and his daughter blocked me at the door, calling me a legal nobody in front of everyone. 1 week later, I returned not with tears, but with a locked metal box. Inside was something that shattered her entire world. If you think this is just another family drama, you're dead wrong. Subscribe now so you won't miss the next gripping story from us. The sky over St. Gideon's Church was the kind of cold gray that felt personal. It didn't drizzle or storm, it just hung there, pressing down on everyone like a weighted curtain, a funeral sky. Agnes stood at the black wrought iron gates in a coat far too thin for late November. Her gloved hands clutched the strap of her worn leather purse, the only thing that didn't tremble. Inside, the organ began to play the opening hymn, a slow, aching rendition of Nearer My God to Thee. It was a song she and Jerome had sung together for decades, sitting side by side in pew 7 left side. The sound floated out of the church windows, filtered through stained glass and grief. She took a step forward. "Stop right there!" Marla's voice came sharp, clear, and rehearsed. Agnes froze. Marla stood at the top of the church steps, flanked by 2 men in black coats, her husband Peter and a family friend, both looking uncomfortable but unmoved. Agnes noticed how perfectly Marla had done her hair, not a strand out of place, not even in the wind. Her heels clicked as she descended 1 step, her expression a mask of barely veiled contempt. "You're not welcome here." Agnes's lips parted slightly. She hadn't prepared for this, not because she didn't expect it, but because she didn't think it would happen in public. Marla turned, addressing the crowd, beginning to filter in behind her. "This woman is not Jerome's legal widow. She has no standing here. I'm sorry, but we won't allow this service to be disrupted." The word disrupted landed like a slap. Gasps rippled through the group. Some stopped confused. Others looked down at the pavement. One woman, the florist from across the street. Agnes recognized her, vaguely murmured something to her husband, and turned away. A man in a navy trench coat whispered, "Isn't that his wife?" The reply was a shrug and an averted gaze. Agnes didn't move. Her fingers tightened around the purse. Her nails, polished pale pink, dug into the leather. "Please," she said, her voice barely audible above the hymn. Marla stepped down another stair, lowering her voice as she came closer. "Don't make a scene, Agnes. It's already bad enough that you're here. You're not part of this family anymore, if you ever were." The sting of it landed behind Agnes's ribs, but she still didn't flinch. She looked past Marla into the open doors of the church, just in time to catch a glimpse of Jerome's casket being wheeled down the aisle. It was walnut wood polished too shiny. Jerome would have hated it. He always said funerals should be plain and sincere, not expensive showpieces for people who barely showed up when he was alive. "I was his wife," Agnes said, "for 22 years. You were his mistake." Marla shot back, smiling thinly. "And now he's gone. This is family only. Jerome and I were married in 1994, and divorced in every meaningful way in the years that followed," Marla snapped. "Don't humiliate yourself, Agnes. You're just a leftover." That did it. Agnes turned slowly, her shoulders squared, not in defeat, but in defiance. She faced the street, not looking back. Someone behind her muttered, "Jesus." Someone else said nothing, but their pity cut deeper than any blade. She walked down the sidewalk slowly, deliberately, like someone holding back a flood. Not a tear escaped. Her face, lined and calm, looked carved from stone. That was what they would remember, not a broken woman, but one who walked away when she could have screamed. Back at home, the heater clanked like it was choking on years. She turned it off. Agnes sat in her kitchen, the kind of kitchen nobody renovates, because it belonged to someone else first. The linoleum floor was worn thin under the chair legs. The tea kettle was stained at the bottom. The gas stove ticked when she turned the knob and flared to life in a blue whisper. She lit it anyway. She needed the noise. With shaking hands, she pulled an old notebook from the drawer one Jerome had gifted her the year after they married. On the inside cover, in his unmistakable left-leaning print, "To my Agnes. If I forget, remind me who I was when I found you." She flipped to the back pages where she'd once written the milestones of their shared life anniversaries, doctor visits, holiday recipes. Her eyes lingered on one line half faded in pencil. Box at Citadel Bank, key taped inside red cookbook in case I forget. She didn't move for a long time. The wind rattled the loose window pane. The world outside was quiet and polite, as if unaware that something holy had just been ripped away from her and tossed aside like trash. Finally she stood, walked to the shelf, pulled out the red cookbook with the plastic spiral binding that was cracked along the edge. She flipped through the pages, roast chicken carrot muffins, Hungarian goulash. And there it was, a key dulled by time, taped to the page labeled lemon bars. Agnes held it in her palm. Its weight was modest. Its meaning wasn't. She stared at it for a moment before whispering, "You remembered." There were no tears then either, only a steady resolve building somewhere beneath her ribs, the way pressure builds behind a dam. The next morning she rose before the sun, dressed in gray slacks and a navy blouse. Jerome always said made her eyes look like summer storm clouds. She did her hair with care, not because she needed to, but because dignity was something no one could give or take. It was something you chose. She walked into Citadel Bank like a woman with nothing to lose. The security guard greeted her by name. "Been a while, Mrs. Whitaker." "Too long," she said, managing a smile. "I'm here to access box 114. He scanned her ID. "Of course, right this way." Down the corridor past the vault door. The manager met her at the private room, key in hand, gloves on. Agnes inserted her key. The box slid out with a heavy sigh. Inside, a thick envelope sealed and marked for Agnes Whitaker, only to be opened after my death. And beneath it, a smaller folder containing notarized documents, contracts, photographs. The manager said nothing, only nodded and left her alone. Agnes sat at the table, unsealed the envelope, the first line in Jerome's hand. "If you're reading this, then they've done it, and I'm sorry." She read in silence, paragraph by paragraph, sentence by sentence. Her hands did not shake, not once. When she stood to leave, she left behind the envelope, but she took the contract. That afternoon, a certified notary and a silver-haired man named Wallace, for whom Jerome had once done taxes back in 1989, walked with her to the Elm Street property. Marla wasn't home. Agnes unlocked the door herself, not as an intruder, but as a co-owner. She didn't need to make a scene, because the war hadn't even started yet, and Agnes Whitaker had just opened the first page of her final chapter, not as a widow forgotten, not as a leftover, but as the woman Jerome remembered, trusted, and protected in death when the living failed to do so. And she would not be erased. Not this time, not ever. The next morning, Agnes stood in the marble foyer of Citadel Bank, the envelope from Jerome pressed tightly against her chest. Sunlight spilled through the tall windows, catching dust in the air and painting soft streaks on the polished floor. She looked small beneath the high ceilings, an aging woman in a slate-gray coat and low-heeled shoes, but her posture was steady. "Can I help you, ma'am?" the banker asked a young man with an efficient smile and a name tag that read Miles. Agnes reached into her purse and unfolded a page Jerome had written by hand in 2015. "I'm here for safe deposit box 114. The authorization should be under Jerome Whitaker." Miles glanced at the note, then typed into his computer. The rhythm of his fingers slowed. His eyes lifted. "I'll need to verify this with our branch manager." "Of course," Agnes replied. A few minutes later, the branch manager came out, a woman in her 60s, with silver hair and sharp eyes. Her expression shifted when she saw the name on the file. "You're Mrs. Agnes Whitaker." "I am." This box was listed as private. Mr. Whitaker left very specific instructions. "You're listed as the sole recipient upon confirmation of his passing. Would you mind?" She gestured discreetly toward a packet of documentation. Agnes removed Jerome's death certificate from her purse. She had carried it with her, folded precisely for 2 days. The manager reviewed it, silently nodded, and then gave a look that softened into something near reverence. "This way." They descended a hallway with a vault door that looked like it belonged to a submarine. Inside the vault, the box was long, heavy, and marked with a small brass plaque, number 114, Whitaker J. The manager stepped back. "Take your time." Agnes ran her fingers along the edge before sliding the box out. The weight of it sent a shiver through her. She carried it into the adjacent viewing room, sat down, and slowly lifted the lid. Inside, everything was carefully arranged in a manila folder labeled in Jerome's hand, "Agnes for truth if needed." She opened it. On top lay a certified copy of their marriage license, dated May 22, 1994, from a courthouse in Vermont. Beneath it, a notarized post-nuptial agreement signed 6 months later, an agreement that established Agnes as co-owner of any property Jerome acquired from that date forward, including the historic townhouse on Elm Street. There were bank records, tax filings, copies of the house deed listing both their names in full. Even a letter from the original realtor congratulating Mr. and Mrs. Whitaker on the purchase of the Elms property in 1997. And tucked into the folder's back sleeve was a photograph of them, Jerome and Agnes, standing on the steps of that very house, arms wrapped around each other, grinning like fools. A garden hose coiled behind them, a patch of sunflowers stretching to the left. Agnes stared at it for a long time. It hadn't been a fantasy. She hadn't imagined her place in his life. He'd given it to her in full without apology. And now in this silent vault, Jerome's hand was still guiding hers. She picked up the documents, placed them in her bag, and stood. Outside the bank doors, a black car idled by the curb. A figure waited inside, a man in a pinstriped suit, gray-haired eyes kind but steady. Wallace Cormack, retired public notary, old friend of Jerome's, and the only person Jerome ever trusted with the truth that couldn't be spoken aloud. He stepped out as she approached. "Agnes, Wallace, thank you for coming. Jerome would haunt me if I didn't." They shared a brief smile. There was no time for more. Agnes slid into the back seat. Wallace followed. The driver took off without a word, heading toward Elm Street. Inside the car, the tension was a third passenger. "Everything's intact?" Wallace asked. "Yes." He opened a thin folder of his own, placed it on his lap. "I've already reviewed the notary log. All filings are valid." Jerome was meticulous. He always was. Wallace looked over. "You don't have to do this today." "Yes," she said, "I do." They turned onto Elm Street just before noon. The house looked as it always had, red brick, black shutters, ivy climbing up the left column. But today it felt like something else. Not a home, not yet. A battleground, maybe, or a courtroom with no judge. Marla's car was parked in the drive, a silver SUV, spotless as always. Agnes stepped out of the car with the folder pressed to her side. She walked up the cobblestone path. Her shoes clicked deliberately evenly. She stopped at the door and knocked. The sound echoed for a beat, then footsteps, then the click of a lock. The door creaked open. Marla appeared in a gray turtleneck, bare-faced hair, pulled back with surgical precision. Her eyes widened just a flicker, and then narrowed. Agnes said nothing. She simply extended the document, holding it like a badge. Marla didn't take it. Instead, she stepped onto the threshold, arms folded. "What is this?" "You know what it is," Wallace replied, stepping into view. "Legal documentation establishing Mrs. Agnes Whitaker as co-owner of this property under a marital and property agreement, filed and notarized in 1994 with continuous legal standing." Marla's jaw clenched. "This is my father's house. It's not just his. It hasn't been for nearly 30 years. Jerome never mentioned this," she snapped. "That doesn't change its legality," Wallace said calmly. Marla turned her gaze to Agnes. "This doesn't mean anything. Paper is paper. This house has been in my name for the past 6 months. That filing," Wallace replied, "was made without full disclosure and may constitute fraudulent conveyance. I suggest you check your legal footing before you make declarations you'll regret." Marla looked past Wallace to Agnes again. "You don't belong here." Agnes remained silent. Not a single syllable, not even a blink. The silence was louder than anything she could have said. Marla's expression faltered. For a moment she looked like she might slam the door shut, but something stopped her. Instead, she stepped back, leaving the door ajar. She didn't say come in. She didn't need to. Agnes stepped into the house. It smelled like citrus polish and cold marble. But underneath that, something older: lavender soap, leather books, the ghost of dinners that no one cooked anymore. The hallway was familiar. The rug was the same one she'd picked out in 2001. The picture frames along the staircase wall hadn't changed, though she noticed several photos had been replaced. Every one of her had been removed. She didn't pause. In the living room, Marla stood like a statue. Agnes pulled the deed from the folder and set it on the oak coffee table. "This is the original," Wallace said. "It will hold up in court. It's also been filed with the county recorder's office as of this morning. If you'd like to contest it, I suggest you find counsel who specializes in estate fraud." "You think you can come back after all this time and just insert yourself again?" Marla said the words bitter, nearly trembling. Agnes turned and looked at her. "I didn't insert myself," she said, voice low but unwavering. "I never left. You just chose to pretend I didn't exist." Marla stepped closer, her voice tightening. "You think some dusty document and a washed-up notary can rewrite history? He chose me. He gave me power of attorney. I made the end-of-life decisions. I was the one who handled everything while you drugged him," Agnes said softly. The silence that followed was immediate and suffocating. Marla flinched like she'd been slapped. "Excuse me." Agnes reached into her bag and pulled out the final item from Jerome's file, a copy of his medical chart time-stamped 6 months prior to his passing, listing heavy dosages of lorazepam prescribed by a doctor Jerome had never visited. "The prescriptions were flagged," Wallace said. "The attending physician listed on the chart lost his license 3 years ago. There's no record of Jerome being seen by him, and yet the medications were delivered to this address." Marla said nothing. Agnes didn't move. She just watched, waited, and when Marla finally spoke, her voice came out smaller, tighter. "This house was supposed to be mine." Agnes stared at her for a moment longer, then turned, walked to the front door, and stepped outside. She didn't slam the door. She didn't speak again. She just left the truth sitting in the middle of the room, surrounded by silence. And that Agnes knew was louder than anything she could ever say. The afternoon light poured through the tall windows of the Elms Street house, casting golden bars across the floor. Agnes stood at the foot of the staircase, the silence around her as loud as thunder. The house, once filled with the quiet comfort of lived-in things, now felt sterile, controlled, sanitized of history. She climbed the stairs slowly, one hand brushing the banister that she and Jerome had painted together after a wine-fueled weekend 20 years ago. The paint had chipped near the 3rd step, where Jerome used to joke it gave the house character. That chip was gone now, repainted over in some generic beige. The 2nd-floor hallway stretched ahead like a memory. Agnes pushed open the door to what used to be their shared bedroom. It didn't look the same. The walls were stripped of art. The bed had been replaced. Even the floral curtains she once hemmed by hand were gone. But in the corner, wedged between the new dresser and the wall, stood a box, worn unlabeled, forgotten. She pulled it out. Dust lifted from the lid like a sigh. Inside were photos, hundreds of them, loose prints, old Polaroids packets from 1-hour film developing labs long gone. She sat on the floor and began to sift through them. A picture of her and Jerome, cheeks pressed together, eyes squinted in laughter during a trip to the mountains. Another of them dancing in the backyard under string lights. She remembered the song Blue Moon and how Jerome had dipped her so low she nearly dropped her wine. She smiled. But then the next photo jarred her. It was their wedding portrait, the one taken at the small chapel in Vermont. A soft focus image with her in a pale blue dress and Jerome in a gray suit. But something was wrong. Her face had been cut out, not torn, cut, cleanly, surgically, like someone had taken a blade and removed her as if she had never existed. She stared at it, her breath shallow. She flipped to the next photo. Another wedding shot, only this time just Jerome standing alone, the space beside him empty. And then another, their anniversary dinner at the lake house, but she was cropped out. She remembered the original well. It had been framed in the hallway for years. She reached into the box and pulled out more, her hands trembling. Picture after picture, erased, edited, missing. She wasn't just being excluded now. She had been erased retroactively, piece by piece, as if someone were rewriting Jerome's life and Agnes along with it. Her heart pounded. She dug deeper into the box, fingers hitting the bottom. There, nestled beneath a pile of yellowing receipts, was something unexpected. A small rectangular cassette tape, the kind used in handheld recorders. labeled in Jerome's shaky handwriting. Journal June, July. Agnes blinked at it, then rose to her feet like someone moving underwater. In the hallway closet behind boxes of Marla's holiday decorations and neatly labeled storage bins, she found it the old portable cassette recorder they used to take on road trips. Jerome had used it for grocery lists, sermon notes, and sometimes talking to himself when he couldn't sleep. She carried it to the kitchen, sat at the table, and fed in the tape. Her fingers hovered over the worn plastic buttons. Then she pressed play. The machine whirred, for a moment only static, then Jerome's voice. June 14th. Agnes is asleep, I think. Hard to tell these days. Agnes froze. His voice was slower than she remembered, hesitant, but unmistakably his. Marla says I need to take the pills twice a day now. For memory, for balance. I told her Agnes doesn't think it's necessary, but she insisted. Said I've been confused, that I forgot my own address last week. I didn't. I just didn't want to go home. A long pause. Something's wrong. I can feel it in the way she watches me, the way she locks the drawer where she keeps my prescriptions. Agnes doesn't know. I don't want her to worry. Agnes's hand covered her mouth. She paused the tape, rewound 5 seconds, pressed play again. I don't want her to worry. Tears welled in her eyes, but she forced herself to listen. June 20th. I woke up on the floor. Don't remember falling. Marla says I was dizzy, that the doctor warned me, but I haven't seen the doctor, not in months. She's been bringing me bottles with no labels. I asked her where they're from. She said not to be paranoid. Agnes gripped the table edge. She said Agnes wouldn't understand, that it was better this way. I think I made a mistake giving her power of attorney last year. She pressured me, said it was just a precaution. The recording clicked as Jerome stopped to catch his breath. The rustle of papers, a soft cough. June 29th. Agnes made soup. I wanted to eat it, but Marla said it wasn't good for me. She threw it out when Agnes wasn't looking. Later, I tried to write a letter. I think I did, but I can't find it now. Agnes could hear her own breathing now, shallow, shaky. July 1st. Agnes, if you're hearing this, something is wrong. I'm losing pieces of myself. You need to check the safe deposit box. I put everything in there. The papers, the deed, the copies. If something happens to me, don't trust what Marla tells you. The tape clicked again, then silence, followed by the final line. His voice cracked on the last word. Agnes rewound the tape, played that sentence again. She leaned back in the kitchen chair. The room spun. The kettle on the stove whistled sharply, but she didn't get up. She sat still for what felt like hours, the cassette player humming its gentle static now that the tape had run out. She closed her eyes and tried to picture Jerome, not the man in the casket, not the man removed from photos, but the man who used to dance barefoot in the rain with her, the man who once tried to build a birdhouse and ended up with a squirrel condo. She remembered a night 2 years ago when Jerome had looked at her across the dinner table and said, "I don't know who I am when you're not around." She'd laughed then, playfully accusing him of being sentimental. Now she understood. He hadn't been trying to charm her. He'd been warning her. In the corner of the kitchen sat a small filing cabinet. She opened the bottom drawer. Inside, neatly filed, were old utility bills, expired warranties, and a worn leather notebook Jerome used to scribble thoughts in. She flipped it open. Halfway through, she found an entry dated July 3rd, 2021. She brought a man to the house today, said he was from the clinic, but he never showed me credentials. He asked me questions like I was a stranger in my own home. I pretended to be confused. I think they're trying to make it official. Agnes closed the book and rested her hand on the counter. She had spent weeks believing she had been forgotten, erased. She had been mourning a betrayal she thought had come from Jerome, but it hadn't. It had come from someone else entirely. And now she had the story Jerome couldn't write into a will. A story hidden in tapes, scribbles, photos with cut-out faces. A story of a man trying to hold on to truth while losing his grip on reality. He hadn't been lost. He'd been silenced. And Agnes, with his voice in her hands, would not let that silence continue. The knock on the door was soft, almost uncertain. Agnes didn't answer at first. She sat in the living room, Jerome's notebook in her lap. The cassette tape still lying beside the player stopped at that final phrase. Emoi, kaduzida sai. The knock came again, firmer this time. She rose, moving slowly, opened the door a crack. It was Evelyn, the woman from next door. Mid-80s, maybe more. The kind of neighbor who always remembered birthdays and hated artificial sweeteners. She wore a cardigan covered in cat hair and a pair of large sunglasses that didn't fully hide the worry in her eyes. Agnes, she said, her voice brittle. May I come in for a moment? Agnes stepped aside. Evelyn shuffled in like she carried something heavy but not in her arms. I heard what happened at the funeral, she said, sitting without waiting. That girl, Marla. She always had a cold mouth. But I didn't think. Her voice faltered. She looked around the room as if expecting to see Jerome sitting in his usual chair, polishing his glasses or napping mid-sentence. I should have come to you earlier, Evelyn said finally. But I didn't know how. Agnes tilted her head slightly. Come to me about what? Evelyn pulled a small tissue from her sleeve and twisted it in her hands. Jerome used to come over late at night. Not often, just when something felt wrong. Agnes went still. He'd knock on the back door, always gentle, always polite. Sometimes he'd be shaking. Said he didn't trust the pills. Said things were being done without his consent. Agnes sat down across from her. Evelyn continued. One night he told me Marla had made him sign papers, but wouldn't show him what. Said it was for his health. Power of attorney, maybe. But he looked scared, Agnes. Genuinely scared. Agnes's breath came shallow. He asked me to write things down for him once. Said his hands weren't steady enough. He dictated a note, part of it at least, but then he stopped. Got paranoid. Burned it in my kitchen sink. Do you remember what it said? Agnes asked. Evelyn looked down. Not all of it, but the line that stuck with me. If I don't make it through this, don't trust what Marla tells you about my doctors. Agnes felt her stomach twist. The echo of Jerome's voice from the cassette still rang in her ears. It all lined up. Why didn't you tell me? I was afraid, Evelyn said, eyes wet now. Afraid it wasn't my place. Afraid I'd be dragged into something messy. But after what she did to you, I couldn't stay quiet. Agnes stood up, walked into the kitchen, pulled open the drawer where she kept envelopes, pens, and batteries. Inside, beneath an old flashlight, was a scrap of folded paper. She had found it that morning tucked behind the boiler in the laundry room. Jerome's hiding places were always strange and specific. The handwriting was his, though more wobbly than usual. It read, If something happens, and I can't speak for myself, don't believe Marla. About the treatments, about the decisions, especially not the doctor. I never met him. Something isn't right. She brought it out and laid it on the coffee table in front of Evelyn. Evelyn gasped softly. That's it, that's the note. Agnes nodded, her voice flat. He wrote it, hid it, and then tried to tell us the only way he could. Evelyn reached out and gently covered Agnes's hand. What are you going to do? Find out who the doctor is, Agnes said. And what exactly they gave my husband. 2 days later, Agnes stood in the reception area of St. Emery Medical Center, the last place Jerome had been treated before hospice care. The air smelled like antiseptic and warm plastic. The waiting area was full of quiet conversations and the distant beep of monitors. A young woman in scrubs approached the desk. Can I help you? Agnes slid a folded piece of paper across the counter. I'm requesting information regarding the treatment of my husband, Jerome Whitaker. This is a notarized request. I'm listed as his medical proxy and spouse in this documentation. The nurse, early 30s, brown ponytail, tired eyes, read the form carefully. Her name tag read K. Moreno. She frowned. Give me a moment. Agnes waited. Every second felt like a stitch pulling tighter across her chest. After several minutes, the nurse returned. According to our records, Mr. Whitaker was last seen here 7 months ago by a Dr. Charles Menley. Agnes's face hardened. May I speak with him? The nurse's mouth tightened. Dr. Menley resigned 2 years ago. Agnes blinked. That can't be. Your records say... I know what they say. The nurse lowered her voice. But I'm telling you, he no longer works here, and hasn't for some time. Agnes stared at her heart hammering. So how is he listed as Jerome's physician? The nurse hesitated, glanced over her shoulder, then leaned in slightly. We're not supposed to discuss anything further without a subpoena. but off the record, his name shouldn't be on any recent files. And yet, his signature appears several times in the last 3 months of your husband's chart. Agnes felt the room tip for a second. There's more, the nurse whispered. Mr. Whitaker's file was modified at least 3 times. I noticed it during a data audit last week. The system logs every time a file's accessed. His was opened remotely twice from a private terminal. That's not standard procedure. Agnes steadied herself against the counter. Who modified it? The nurse glanced around again, then quietly slid over a sticky note. A number, a name, M. Garrison. Agnes didn't need to ask who that was. Her fingers closed around the note like it was a detonator. Thank you, she said softly. The nurse nodded and with a glance of silent encouragement turned away. Agnes walked out into the sunlight, the wind colder than she remembered. She didn't cry, not yet. But something inside her had shifted. There were stories Jerome hadn't been able to finish, letters he'd never sent, warnings that had come in fragments and whispers. But now the puzzle pieces were moving into place. She would not let those stories be buried beside him. And Marla, no matter how carefully she had rewritten the narrative, was about to find out that Agnes Whitaker remembered how to read between the lines. The door to the Office of Records and Public Documentation creaked open as Agnes stepped inside, clutching a folder against her chest. The building had that government-sent old paper recycled air, something antiseptic and permanent. It was quiet, except for the hum of fluorescent lights and the occasional clatter of a distant copier. A woman behind the plexiglass window looked up, middle-aged, lipstick smudged just slightly. Her badge read Danielle S., Clerk 3rd. Agnes approached, voice clear. I need to verify a legal document. It concerns my late husband, Jerome Whitaker. I believe a psychiatric capacity evaluation was filed under his name. I'd like to compare the signature to verified records. Danielle's brow arched subtly. Do you have the document number? Agnes opened her folder and slid the copy of the evaluation across the metal tray beneath the glass. Danielle scanned it, then blinked. Give me a moment, she said. She disappeared into the back shoes squeaking on the linoleum. Agnes stood motionless, eyes trained on the sealed door behind the counter. A man in a suit passed by behind her, not even glancing in her direction. Minutes later, Danielle returned with a slim file in her hands. She looked at Agnes differently now, less bureaucratic, more human. I pulled the certified signature record we have on file for your husband, she said, slipping the original beside the document Agnes had provided. The contrast was immediate. Jerome's signature had always been tight, angular, leaning slightly forward. The signature on the psychological evaluation was round, loose, and wrong. Agnes didn't need forensic analysis. She'd watched him sign every birthday card, every check, every anniversary note. That's not his handwriting, Agnes whispered. Danielle nodded, then lowered her voice. This evaluation was filed under Emergency Protective Health Order. The person listed as temporary guardian was Marla Garrison. Agnes felt her spine stiffen. Danielle flipped the file. It was signed, time-stamped, and entered. But the strange part is it was withdrawn 48 hours later. No follow-up documentation, no court affirmation. It just vanished. Withdrawn by whom? Danielle hesitated, then leaned closer. An internal memo flagged the withdrawal as irregular. It was processed under an override code, private terminal. Not even from this department. Agnes swallowed hard. May I have a copy of this record? Danielle hesitated. Technically, I'm not supposed to print anything that's flagged as pending review without a formal petition. She glanced around. No one else was watching. Then she slid a paper into the tray upside down. I'll pretend I printed it by mistake. Agnes picked it up with a nod of silent gratitude. Danielle pressed her lips together. Whoever did this didn't just bend the rules, they rewrote them. That afternoon, Agnes found herself once again in Wallace Cormac's office. His study smelled of cedar and old paper, and the late sun filtered in through the slatted blinds in golden strips. He sat behind his desk, hands steepled, watching her with that lawyer's stillness he always carried. She laid out the forged document, the withdrawal record, and the sticky note from the hospital clerk. Wallace read everything, twice, then sat back. Well, he said she wasn't subtle. She didn't need to be, Agnes replied. Jerome trusted her. I did too. For a while. Wallace tapped the page. This isn't just unethical, it's criminal. Filing false medical records, impersonating a physician, obtaining power of attorney under false pretenses. She could face felony charges. Agnes's gaze didn't waver. I'm not ready for court. Wallace raised an eyebrow. Why? Because she's not done yet. Wallace considered her for a long beat, then nodded slowly. You want to let her expose herself further? She's already cracked, Agnes said. I want to see her shatter. Wallace folded his hands. When the time comes, I'll file everything, but I need you to be sure. I'll be sure when I look her in the eye and she knows I know. The confrontation came sooner than expected. Agnes returned home that evening to find Marla's SUV parked at the curb, engine idling. She stepped out of her car, clutching her purse tight, and walked past the vehicle without glancing. Agnes, Marla's voice called. Agnes stopped, turned. Her face was a mask. Marla got out of the car, her heels crunching on the gravel. She was dressed in tailored black, her mouth painted in a shade too bold for sympathy. You've been busy, Marla said. Agnes didn't answer. Marla stepped closer. Public records hospital visits. Really, you're digging in the wrong grave. Agnes kept her eyes steady. I'm not the one burying the truth. Marla's smile was thin, dry. Look, I know you're upset, but poking around like this, you're making a fool of yourself. And frankly, you're not well. Agnes narrowed her eyes. Don't. Marla's voice lowered, almost silky. I could have you evaluated. Again. And this time the paper trail would be a lot harder to erase. Agnes said nothing. I've been documenting your behavior, Marla continued. The erratic visits, the accusations. You look unhinged, Agnes. All it takes is a few key words and a judge will see what I see: a woman clinging to a fantasy marriage unraveling by the day. Agnes let the words hang in the air, let them rot. Then she leaned forward just slightly, voice as cold as marble. You erased my face from photos. You drugged your father. You forged documents. And you think I'm the one losing my grip. Marla's expression slipped for half a second. Just enough. Agnes straightened. I'm not the one who should be scared, Marla. You can't prove anything, Marla hissed. Agnes tilted her head. That's what you said about the forged psych eval. Funny thing, turns out the state has backup logs. Marla blinked. Her mouth opened, closed. Agnes stepped past her, unlocking the front door of the house. Before she entered, she turned one last time. You're right about one thing, she said. I was quiet for too long, but not anymore. She closed the door. Inside, the silence greeted her like a promise kept. She set down her purse, her coat, her breath, and then she picked up the phone. Not to call Wallace. Not yet. She called the Department of Elder Affairs. The voice on the other end, warm, professional, curious. My name is Agnes Whitaker, she said calmly. I have reason to believe someone committed medical fraud to gain control over a vulnerable elder. I'd like to make a formal report. She gave the names, the dates, the documents. She answered every question without pause. And when the intake officer asked, would you be willing to testify if necessary? She said without hesitation, yes, because the lies were starting to fray. The mask was slipping. And for the first time in months, Agnes felt like the ground beneath her feet was hers again. Let Marla threaten, let her spin her stories. Agnes wasn't playing defense anymore. She was preparing for the reckoning, and it was coming. Agnes had always been the kind of woman who preferred quiet preparation to loud confrontation. But some truths didn't wait politely to be discovered. They clawed their way to the surface no matter how much effort someone put into burying them. On a crisp Tuesday morning, she placed the small black recording device disguised as a decorative clock on the bookshelf across from the living room sofa. Another was tucked discreetly under the hallway sideboard. The cameras were motion-activated, voice-sensitive, and completely silent. Marla had developed a habit of coming by unannounced, as if her presence in the house she tried to steal was something she never had to explain. And Agnes, always gracious, always restrained, never stopped her, not anymore. That afternoon, Marla arrived. No knock. She let herself in, stilettos tapping across the tile as she swept into the house like it was a red carpet entrance. Agnes remained in the kitchen, quiet hands in the sink, wiping a perfectly clean glass. Marla didn't even greet her. Instead, she pulled out her phone, settled onto the living room sofa, and dialed. Agnes kept trying. Hey, it's me, Marla said, voice dropping. Yeah, she's still here, still poking around. A pause. No, I haven't told her about the trust revocation yet. I need that to go through first. Then I'll hand her something official. Maybe she'll finally pack up and go quietly. Another pause. Her voice dropped lower. Look, I'm not heartless, okay? I gave her time. I let her stay in the house. But we both know she doesn't have the energy or the finances to drag this through court. Agnes gripped the towel tighter. I just want to clean this up without dragging the family name through another public mess. Marla continued. Some kind of mediation. Fast. Clean. She gets a small settlement, I get the house. Done. She gave a mirthless little laugh. Honestly, she's not going to last long enough to fight. What is she, 70-something? You should see her. Fragile. One good scare and she'll fold. Silence. Then more laughter. And don't get me started on that old man. Dad was a liability his last year. Confused. Petty. Barely lucid. He kept scribbling things in notebooks like anyone cared. A stubborn old headache. Agnes pressed the towel to the counter, face unreadable. The call ended. Footsteps. Marla peeked into the kitchen. I'm heading out, she called breezily. Try not to tire yourself. Agnes didn't turn around. The door clicked shut behind her. That night, Agnes transferred the files to her laptop. The audio was clean, the video sharper than she expected. Her breath caught as she replayed Marla's voice. Not because she needed to hear it again, but because she wanted to remember how cruelty sounded when it believed itself invincible. She sent a copy to Wallace Cormack, another to the Office of Elder Legal Advocacy, and one to the District Attorney's Public Interest Division marked possible abuse of power of attorney medical fraud and coercive estate control. By noon the next day, she had a call back. By Thursday, Marla had a summons. The courthouse smelled like lemon disinfectant and old linoleum. Agnes sat in the second row of the hearing room dressed in slate blue, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The prosecutors were young but sharp. They laid out the facts in clear, methodical order, falsified capacity evaluations, unexplained medical record alterations, emergency guardianship orders filed and rescinded in under 48 hours, and now damning audio from inside the Whitaker residence. Marla sat beside her lawyer, eyes wide, lips parted in disbelief. Her usual confidence bled away under the sterile lights. Her hair, normally perfect, was pulled into a tight bun that looked more desperate than professional. The recording played aloud. Agnes didn't flinch as her own silence echoed back through the room. She watched Marla's jaw tighten, watched the lawyer beside her scribble something fast and panicked on a legal pad. And then, at the end of the recording, after the line, "She won't last long enough to fight," the room fell into thick, astonished quiet. Then the prosecutor stood and spoke. This is not a matter of estate preferences or family misunderstandings. This is about the systemic exploitation of an aging man and his wife whose voices were nearly erased. But not entirely. Agnes's heart pounded with something strange. Not victory, not satisfaction. Certainty. When the hearing broke for recess, Marla stood abruptly. Her chair slammed backward against the bench. She turned to Agnes, pointing a trembling finger. "This is my father's house," she said through clenched teeth. "Mine, not hers, not some sad little woman clinging to the past. I was there, I made the decisions. I was the only one who actually," Marla, her lawyer, hissed, "Sit down." But she didn't. She took a step closer. "I took care of him when he couldn't walk. I handled the bills. I signed the papers. She didn't do any of it. She just sat in the garden drinking her little teas while Marla, I deserved that house." Agnes met her eyes calm and steady. "You forged your father's trust," she said softly. Marla blinked. Agnes stood. "You poisoned him with silence, with pills, with shame. And when that wasn't fast enough for you, you tried to erase me too. But you forgot something." Marla said nothing. Agnes took a step forward, voice now low and sharp like a blade being drawn. "You forgot he remembered me, enough to leave behind proof." The judge called the room to order. Marla turned away, breath shallow. Her mask had cracked, and the room had seen the face beneath. Outside reporters waited. Agnes bypassed them without a word. She didn't need headlines. She had the truth. And Marla now had a different kind of silence, the kind the law was no longer willing to ignore. The courtroom was colder that day. Or maybe it was just Agnes's hands that wouldn't warm. She sat at the long oak table, eyes steady, lips still. Across from her, Marla barely made eye contact. Her lawyer adjusted his tie so often it became a nervous twitch. The judge entered a woman with silver-streaked hair and a voice that left no room for sentiment. "We'll resume the matter of Whitaker versus Garrison," she said, her tone clipped. Agnes stood. "I have one more document for the court to consider," she said, unfolding a single sheet from the leather folder in front of her. She handed it to the bailiff, who passed it up to the judge. "This is a notarized copy of a postnuptial agreement signed on June 3, 1994, in Rutland County, Vermont. It clearly identifies both Jerome Whitaker and myself as equal co-owners of all assets acquired from that date forward, including the property at 112 Elm Street." The judge read the document slowly, then raised an eyebrow. "It appears properly notarized. Witnesses listed. Signatures consistent," Agnes continued. "On the second page, Your Honor, you'll find a handwritten addendum. Jerome wrote it himself." The judge turned the page. Her expression shifted slightly from judicial neutrality to something that looked just barely like human recognition. She read aloud. "Because you are the one who pulled me out of the dark. The woman who gave me shelter when no one else would. This house is as much yours as the breath in my lungs. I came into it with nothing, and I only became a man here because you let me." Silence filled the room. Even the court reporter had stopped typing. Marla stared down at her legal pad, not writing, not blinking. The judge cleared her throat. "We'll recess for 1 hour to validate the authenticity of this contract. If it checks out, we'll resume with amended parameters." She rapped her gavel. "Court is adjourned for recess." As chairs scraped and murmurs rose, Agnes sat back down slowly. She didn't smile. She didn't look triumphant. She looked like someone who had finally laid down a weight she'd been carrying for far too long. The library smelled the way it always had of dry paper old bindings and the whispers of stories never finished. Agnes sat by the window in the genealogy wing, surrounded by archival folders and old newspaper clippings. She wasn't reading any of them. She held a photo, a black and white image yellowed by time edges curled. It had been taken 30 years ago on the sidewalk outside of Hopewell Elder Home. In the photo, she was crouched beside a man, thin, gaunt, filthy. His beard was overgrown, his eyes sunken. Her hand was on his shoulder. She was looking at him, not the camera. And he, Jerome, was looking at her like she was the first human he'd seen in years. She had forgotten the photo even existed until last night, when she'd unearthed it from a storage box in the attic labeled intake files. She used to keep it as a reminder of the work that mattered, of the people who found their way back. Jerome had been brought in after a neighbor called the city about a man sleeping beneath the church awning during a rainstorm. No ID, no money, just a worn-out army field jacket and a note tucked into his boot that read, "Don't let me die alone." Agnes had been working the night shift, intake meals, linens, sometimes prayers. She remembered how he looked at the scrambled eggs she brought him as if they were a foreign delicacy. He didn't speak for the first 2 weeks, but one night she found him sitting on the back steps, holding a carving knife, not for violence, but for shaping wood. He'd taken a broken tree branch and carved it into a bird. "Why a bird?" she had asked. He'd said, "Because I forgot what it feels like to fly." He was the first resident who ever left the home and came back not as a patient, but as a donor, a volunteer, a man who remembered who he'd been before the streets had taken everything, and that Agnes knew was the real truth behind that postnuptial agreement. Not just the legal terms, not just signatures, but the gratitude of a man who'd been rewritten by kindness. She looked down at the photo again. Her hair had been mostly silver even then, but in that shot it looked nearly white under the sun. Jerome had told her later it was that first flash of silver that made him trust her, like someone who wasn't pretending to be young or perfect. That and the scar above her right eyebrow. A birthmark she hated as a child, but that he once traced with his finger and called the comma in your story. She smiled, folded the photo, slipped it back into her bag. Back in the courtroom, the judge resumed her seat with fresh documents in front of her. "The postnuptial agreement and handwritten addendum have been verified," she said. "The signatures match all known exemplars of Mr. Whitaker's writing, and the notarization has been confirmed as authentic." Marla's lawyer leaned over and whispered something fast into her ear. Marla didn't respond. She was frozen in place. The judge continued. "Given the legally binding nature of the 1994 agreement, and the accompanying statement of intention, the property in question shall remain co-owned with primary residency rights awarded to Mrs. Whitaker as surviving spouse. She turned to Agnes. Do you wish to pursue formal charges against Ms. Garrison at this time? Agnes stood. Her voice was calm. No, not yet. But I reserve the right to do so. The judge nodded. Understood. We will reconvene in 30 days for any remaining estate review. As the room emptied, Marla sat alone at the defense table. She looked at Agnes, then really looked at her for the first time, not with contempt or arrogance or strategic calculation, but with something Agnes hadn't seen before. Recognition. Not of defeat, but of exposure. And Agnes, walking out of that courtroom, felt the first breath of freedom settle into her bones, not because the fight was over, but because the truth no longer needed to scream. It had spoken, and it had been heard. The paper was red government red, that deep, impossible-to-ignore color that always meant someone had been stopped. Agnes stood on the sidewalk in front of the house on Elm Street, the wind tugging at the hem of her coat. The seal was taped across the front door, crisscrossed with legal language in bold black letters. Property under temporary asset freeze. Do not enter. A uniformed officer lingered nearby, arms folded, his eyes drifting toward her with something like curiosity. She ignored him. The house looked different now, not physically but spiritually. It had once been the battlefield, now it was simply neutral ground. It didn't belong to Marla or to her, not yet. It belonged to the state for the time being. But Agnes wasn't looking at the seal. She was looking at the window beside it, the same one she used to crack open for Jerome when he smoked his pipe late at night. He always said the air tasted better mixed with silence. She closed her eyes, and for just a second, she could almost smell that mix, the smoke, the fall air, the sound of crickets carrying into the distance. Jerome had sat in that chair just on the other side, a wool blanket over his legs, a book in hand, his voice humming a line from whatever poem he was halfway through memorizing that week. I want to read to you until your bones forget pain, he once told her. The house was sealed now, but his words still leaked through. Agnes exhaled and turned away. It took a 2-hour drive and one wrong turn to find the road that led back to the place where it all started. Sunlight spilled through branches along the narrow lane, casting soft golden shadows across the windshield as Agnes slowed near the gate of St. Bridget's Assisted Living Center. The sign had been replaced since she last visited, but the building was still the same low-roofed, warm-bricked, nestled against a hillside like it belonged there. She parked under a tree, hands resting on the steering wheel for a moment longer than necessary. Her fingers brushed the edge of the envelope in her purse. Inside, the official letter from the court, confirming temporary possession and her right to petition for permanent designation once the investigation concluded. But this trip wasn't about legal rights. This was about roots. The front lobby smelled like cinnamon oatmeal and floor wax. A young man at the desk looked up, startled. "Can I help you?" Agnes smiled gently. "I'm here to see Mrs. Penrose. Tell her Agnes Whitaker is here." The name seemed to ring a bell. He nodded quickly, then picked up the phone. 10 minutes later, she was in the garden under a white pergola tangled with sleeping roses, and then the sliding door opened. Penelope Penrose hadn't aged much. Her shoulders were a little more stooped, her hair fully silver now, but her eyes, the sharp owl-like eyes, were still full of the fire that once ran this place like a ship slicing through fog. She saw Agnes and stopped in her tracks. Then they both moved. No words, just arms around each other and the kind of sob that doesn't come from grief, it comes from recognition, from memory. Penelope pulled back after a long while and held Agnes's face in her hands. "You should have come sooner," she whispered. "I didn't think I could." They sat on the bench under the pergola like they used to. The breeze picked up. Somewhere in the distance, a wind chime played a lazy tune. "Jerome's gone," Agnes said simply. Penelope didn't flinch. "I know." Agnes reached into her purse and pulled out the photo, the black and white one from 30 years ago. She handed it to Penelope. "He came back, you know. After all those years, he turned it all around." Penelope studied the picture, nodded slowly. "You helped him, we both did." Agnes smiled. "But I stayed." Penelope looked at her. And now Agnes stared out into the garden, her voice even. "I want to turn that house into something that matters. If I get it back, I don't want to just live in it." Penelope waited. "I want to turn it into a home for people like Jerome. Not just a place to die in, but a place to rediscover who they were before the world forgot them." She paused. "I want it to be called The Elms. That way, even if the name never changes on paper, it becomes something else entirely." Penelope's eyes glistened. "That house always had too much silence," she said. "I think it's time it learned how to hold life again." They sat in the quiet, the kind of quiet that holds more weight than noise ever could. Birds flitted through the trees. Laughter drifted from the east wing where a volunteer read poetry to the residents. Agnes placed the court letter on the bench between them. "This is just the beginning." Penelope reached over and placed her hand on Agnes's. "No, sweetheart," she said. "This is a return." That evening, as Agnes drove back through the narrowing hills, she thought about all the places that had once felt like home. Some had ceilings that leaked. Some had locks that turned too easily. Some had walls where her face had been cut out of photographs. But she'd learned something in the last few weeks. Home wasn't where you were allowed in. It was where no one could lock you out of yourself. And behind that red-sealed door on Elm Street, something waited, not a building, not a court victory, but a promise that no one else would be erased on her watch. Not ever again. The courtroom was packed, but quiet. A strange silence, the kind that descends when the truth becomes a weight no one wants to lift. Agnes sat 2 rows back, dressed in a navy coat, her hands folded in her lap. Her eyes were calm, steady, not defiant, not triumphant, just present. Like a mountain that had waded through storm after storm and now watched the last cloud pass. Across the aisle, Marla sat, flanked by her attorney and an empty chair. Her hair was pinned back too tight. Her lipstick was too dark. Her eyes were ringed with a sleepless shadow. No family beside her. No allies. The seats behind her row sat hollow, as if people had intentionally stayed away, as if silence had become contagious. The judge entered, a short man with shoulders that had probably held more injustice than one lifetime should have allowed. He adjusted his glasses, then read directly from the folder before him. Having reviewed the submitted evidence, including audio recordings, forensic analysis of psychological documentation, sworn statements from staff at Crestfield Medical, and signed testimony from Ms. Agnes Whitaker and the independent notary public, the court finds that Ms. Marla Garrison knowingly and willfully submitted falsified documents, including but not limited to fabricated mental health evaluations, unauthorized guardianship designations, and forged medical memos related to the late Jerome Whitaker. He paused, looked up. Furthermore, it is determined that these actions were executed with intent to gain exclusive financial control over properties jointly owned by the deceased and his lawful spouse, Ms. Agnes Whitaker. Marla didn't blink. Her face was frozen. Only her fingers moved, twisting at the edge of her blazer sleeve over and over like a nervous tic that had taken up residence in her bloodstream. The judge continued. In addition to document forgery and unlawful representation, the court recognizes a pattern of psychological manipulation toward an elder individual resulting in compromised legal capacity under false pretenses. This constitutes elder abuse. A ripple in the courtroom. A collective inhale, quick and sharp. Like truth had finally pierced through varnished wood and oxygen. The judge folded his hands. Ms. Garrison, these charges, if convicted under criminal court proceedings, carry potential penalties of imprisonment and fines under state elder protection statutes. Marla's lawyer leaned in, whispering something in her ear. She nodded slowly, face still blank, like a child told recess was permanently canceled. The judge turned his gaze to the other side of the courtroom. Ms. Whitaker, as lawful co-owner of the property in question, and with full legal documentation upheld, the court hereby restores full custodial rights and ownership of the estate located at 241 Elm Street to you. A murmur. But Agnes stood. I do not intend to seek financial damages, she said. Her voice was calm, not forced, not rehearsed, just true. I do not want repayment. I do not want her money. I do not want revenge. She turned slightly toward Marla. I want the record to remember what happened. I want the lies to be visible, that's all. She sat back down. For a moment no one spoke. Then the judge nodded, once slow, deliberate. as if to say, "This is how justice breathes, quietly but permanently." The next hour passed in the blur of paperwork and legal formalities, but the tone had changed. It wasn't about ownership anymore. It wasn't about contracts. It was about accountability. After court adjourned, Agnes didn't move right away. She sat and watched as Marla stood, collected her coat, and walked toward the exit alone. No one stopped her. No one said goodbye. No one looked her in the eye. For a woman who once demanded the whole world spin around her pain, the emptiness of that moment was louder than any verdict. Agnes finally stood and walked out into the daylight. She could feel that something had shifted, not in the system, but in herself. That night she sat in her new living room, still half empty, half unpacked. Boxes still sealed, pictures leaned against the wall instead of hung. The fire in the hearth crackled low, more for sound than for heat. She sat in Jerome's old chair. A copy of the court order rested on the table beside her. But what she held in her hands wasn't a legal document. It was the letter he'd once started and never finished. The one she found folded behind the radiator, scrawled on yellowed paper. "If I don't make it through this, don't trust Marla's version of my diagnosis. There's something wrong. I don't always remember things, but I know when someone is making me forget. And if you're reading this, it means I didn't say enough when I still could. But I loved you. I always did. Thank you for bringing me out of the cold that winter, for giving me a life." She read it again, slowly. Not to remember, but to release. Outside, a wind picked up, rattling the bare branches. But inside she was still, because some justice doesn't arrive in the courtroom. It arrives in the silence that comes after. The key turned in the old lock with a sound that echoed not just down the hallway, but into the marrow of Agnes's bones. The house groaned in welcome, like an aging friend standing to greet someone it hadn't seen in years. She stepped in alone. No court officer, no solicitor, no Jerome, just her. A woman 71 with hands older than they looked and eyes that had seen the underbelly of family and survived. Sunlight streamed through the cracked window panes, casting lattices across the dust that had settled like forgotten memories. She walked the corridor barefoot. The wooden floor creaked. The photos on the wall, crooked, half-faded, seemed to recognize her. The first room she entered was the study. A crooked portrait still hung Jerome in his younger years, holding a coffee mug with a faint smirk. Agnes straightened it gently. Then the living room. A frame sat on the mantel, flipped down. She picked it up. It was their wedding photo. But her face had been slashed out, cut carefully, precisely with a razor blade. Marla's precision. Agnes traced the edge of the frame and turned it back upright. The house wasn't hers to own, she realized. It was hers to repair. For 3 weeks, Agnes worked alone. She patched walls with plaster, scrubbed mildew from the kitchen tiles, and replaced a cracked window in the upstairs guest room. Each day she walked down to the little corner shop to buy one more item, paint detergent, light bulbs, and chatted briefly with the clerk who always asked, "And how's the old house coming?" Agnes would reply, "It remembers me." But it was the attic that broke her. On a rainy Thursday afternoon, she pulled the cord and climbed the creaking ladder. Dust rose like smoke. Boxes, stacks of old notebooks, 3 umbrellas, and Jerome's winter coat were all up there. And tucked beneath it, a bundle of letters addressed never to her but to Father. Letters from residents of the nursing home they used to visit together. Letters Jerome had collected and saved. Most were simple. "Thank you for the chess game, sir. Thank you for remembering my birthday. Thank you for letting me sit beside the roses without telling me they were fake." Agnes read them one by one, the way people read scripture, slowly, reverently searching for something more than words. When she emerged from the attic, she didn't carry the coat. She carried the letters. 2 months later, the house looked different, but not new, not perfect, just kind. Walls were painted in soft earth tones. A garden had been planted out front, mostly lavender and rosemary. And on a hand-carved wooden sign nailed to the gate it read, "Agnes and Jerome's house." A place where no one waits behind the door. Inside, soft jazz played on a phonograph. The entry smelled of freshly baked bread. It was opening day. A soft ribbon hung across the front porch. People began arriving in slow streams. Elders from the local community center, former residents from Crestfield Nursing, even a few old friends of Jerome's who hadn't heard from him in decades, but remembered his kindness. Agnes wore a cream shawl and sat on a rocking chair out front as an older man cut the ribbon, his hands shaking with age and honor. The crowd applauded and the first residents walked in. There was no press, no mayor, just people who knew what it meant to be turned away. People who understood that the truest kind of inheritance is space, not space to own, but space to belong. By midday, the garden was filled with soft chatter. In the sun-dappled backyard, Agnes sat beneath a canopy surrounded by canvas and brushes. 10 elderly women and 1 man sat in front of easels painting vases, birds, flowers, and imagined dreams. A little girl, about 12, long braids, visiting her grandmother, watched from the edge of the circle. After a moment, she approached. "Excuse me," she said quietly. Agnes turned, smiling gently. "Yes, sweetheart." The girl sat cross-legged beside her. "Why did you give this house away? You could have lived here just for yourself." Agnes dipped her brush in pale green, painted a curve of a leaf, then set it down. "Because I know what it feels like," she said slowly, "to stand in front of a closed door. To knock and know no one is coming." The girl didn't say anything, but she looked at Agnes with a kind of reverence children reserve for those who've lived through something unspeakable. Agnes continued, "I used to believe a home was something you protected, a fortress. But it's not. A home is something you open, even if the people who once lived in it didn't understand that." They sat in silence for a long time, watching the others paint. Later that evening, as twilight fell, Agnes lit a candle in the hallway window. It flickered behind the glass, visible to anyone who passed by like a lighthouse, not for ships but for souls. She walked back to the living room where 3 residents played checkers and 2 more watched a documentary about lighthouses in Maine. One of the women turned. "Miss Agnes, what's this place going to be when you're gone?" Agnes smiled. "I hope," she said, "it's still warm." She didn't mean the temperature. Outside, the house stood with its porch light glowing. No locks, no silence, no one turned away. Just the sound of laughter through old walls and the faint whisper of memory breathing through the beams. Agnes sat quietly holding a cup of tea and looking at the doorway. It no longer needed to be guarded. It was finally open. The letter arrived on a Monday morning, sealed in an ivory envelope with no return address. The handwriting on the front was delicate, careful, almost too careful, as if written by someone who hadn't touched sincerity in years and wasn't sure how to begin again. Agnes recognized it immediately. She did not open it in the kitchen or in the garden or beneath the oak tree where she often sat with the residents. She opened it in the study, the same study where Jerome used to read aloud letters from old friends and where she now kept his photograph, the only one Marla hadn't touched. Inside the letter was short. "Agnes, I'm sorry for the way I treated you, for the things I said. I was angry, and I let that anger build me into a version of myself I didn't recognize. You were right. I chose the wrong person to become. I don't expect forgiveness, but I needed to say it. Marla." Agnes folded the letter slowly, her fingers trembling not from age but from the weight of something finally being named. She didn't cry. She walked to the mantel, picked up Jerome's photo, and slid the letter just beneath its frame. Then she whispered, her voice steady, "They can't touch me anymore, love. You were right." The sun poured in through the arched window of the central hallway. Agnes stood at the mirror in a simple blue cardigan, her hair pinned back, small pearl earrings glinting in the morning light. In one hand she held Jerome's journal, the leather-bound one soft at the corners that still smelled like the cedar drawer he kept it in. Today she wasn't staying home. Today she was boarding a train to the Caregivers Alliance conference upstate, a gathering of advocates, professionals, and elders who had built entire lives out of quiet resilience. It had been years since she'd traveled anywhere that wasn't connected to survival. But now survival was behind her. Now it was legacy. She glanced around the hallway. A woman in a maroon sweater waved from the front room, one of the center's newer residents. Someone who'd been left by her children outside a police station, confused and clutching only a rosary. "Safe travels, Miss Agnes," the woman called softly. Agnes smiled. "Thank you, darling. Keep the kettle warm." At the train station, Agnes sat near the back of the platform with her suitcase and Jerome's journal in her lap. She didn't read it. She just held it, feeling the weight of every entry like a second heartbeat. She remembered the last thing he'd ever written. If I go before her, may the house remember her hands. She looked up at the open sky and nodded, as if he could still hear her. 3 days later, she returned. The trip had gone well. She'd spoken on stage, clear, steady, and with humor. She'd told the audience, "No one ever believes the elderly can start over, but let me tell you, we're like oaks, cut us down, we grow back stronger." And they'd laughed, and then they'd cried. Back at the center, a celebration was waiting. Nothing grand, just tea and biscuits, and one of the residents had drawn her portrait with crayons on parchment paper. But Agnes didn't go straight to the gathering. She paused at the gate. Outside on the sidewalk stood a woman, mid-50s, worn sneakers, windbreaker jacket torn at one elbow, a canvas bag clutched to her chest. Her hair was matted, her eyes unsure. She was looking at the wooden sign, Agnes and Jerome's house, a place where no one waits behind the door. Agnes stepped forward slowly. The woman startled. "I'm sorry," she said. "I didn't mean to. I was just looking. I heard this place was for people like me." Agnes looked her in the eye. Then she looked at her shoes. Wet. Her ankles trembling from standing too long. "What's your name?" Agnes asked. The woman hesitated. "Catherine." Agnes nodded once. Then she opened the gate. "Come inside, Catherine. The tea's still warm." The hallway smelled of cinnamon. Catherine walked behind her, glancing at the frames on the wall, portraits of smiling residents, clippings from local papers, a hand-drawn timeline of when the center opened. Agnes showed her to a bench in the entryway. "I'll get you a towel and some socks," she said. "No, you don't have to." But Agnes was already walking. When she returned, she handed Catherine the towel and a pair of thick wool socks. As Catherine dried her feet, Agnes sat beside her, placing Jerome's journal gently on the table. "You came at a good time," she said. Catherine smiled faintly. "I didn't know where else to go." Agnes looked out the window. "You found the right door." That night, after the rooms were quiet and the dishes washed and the porch light turned on, Agnes walked back to the study. The letter was still there, Marla's. She didn't move it. She didn't need to. What needed to be said had been said, and what needed to be lived was already happening. She opened Jerome's journal and turned to a blank page. With a steady hand, she wrote, "Today, a woman named Catherine found the house. She was tired. She was unsure, but she knocked, and this time the door opened." She closed the book, and for the first time in years, she didn't dream of being shut out. In the final scene, the morning sun spills through the windows of the old house, catching dust motes like confetti. Residents gather at the long kitchen table, some in robes, some already dressed, some still waking. Agnes pours coffee with a steady hand. At the door, someone knocks. It's a young social worker with another elder, a woman with white hair hunched over but proud. Agnes smiles and walks over. "Welcome," she says. The door opens again, because it always does, and the voiceover rises. Some doors are sealed not to keep people out, but to remind us that justice sometimes is the journey through our own pain. The door closes gently behind them. Fade to black.